They say the best camera is the one that's with you. And if you have any smartphone from the last few years, chances are you have a pretty damn good camera right in your pocket. With recent advances in smartphone camera technology, people are starting to question whether there's really a need for standalone cameras anymore. This is the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and while it's no longer the latest or the greatest, these tiny cameras pack an impressive punch. You can shoot 48 megapixel RAW images using the main 24mm camera, and video at up to 4K 60 FPS. However, while you can still get amazing results on your phone, there are a few areas where I still think they have a lot of improvement to do before they can replace DSLR or mirrorless cameras. Listen, touchscreens are great, and a lot of smartphones, either through their native camera or third-party apps, allow you to use fully manual settings to customize things like shutter speed, ISO, focus, and white balance. With that being said though, I do just think having physical buttons and dials makes taking photo and video a lot quicker and easier. If you don't really know what you're doing or just don't care about manual settings, using a phone is going to be just fine. But for higher end applications, I think this is still a big deal. On the Nikon, I've got dials right where my index finger and thumb are for changing aperture and shutter speed respectively, and when holding down other buttons, these dials change other settings like ISO or autofocus modes. Compare this to the phone where I have to go into each individual setting and change them one at a time. Being able to quickly change camera settings rather than having to mess around with a bunch of menus can sometimes be the difference between getting the shot or not. And while yes, this does come down to personal preference for a lot of people, I think a lot of photographers and videographers are going to prefer the speed and convenience of having physical controls rather than having to rely on a touchscreen. Professional cameras also have so many more features, and the ability to use accessories such as flash guns, off-camera flash, external microphones, headphones and monitors, multiple SD card slots, remote shutter. I could go on. While many phones also support these kinds of accessories, they're still kind of limited. Phones have come a long way in low-light photography. Using long exposures and computational photography lets us get around a lot of the limitations of the smaller sensor. While this works great for relatively still subjects, the same can't be said for moving subjects, as that motion is going to introduce motion blur. In situations where you can't hold the camera still or the subject is moving, you're going to need to increase your shutter speed and therefore ISO to compensate. As you increase your ISO, you're going to start to introduce noise. And the smaller the sensor, the worse this is going to be. This is what the iPhone looks like at 800 ISO. Pretty good, holds up fairly well against the DSLR. Maybe a little bit more noise, but definitely usable. At 3200 ISO, the phone starts struggling a little, but for web content and social media, these are still totally acceptable. 10,000 ISO is where things really fall apart for the iPhone. The photo's becoming a bit of a noisy mess, while the DSLR is still taking perfectly usable images. And keep in mind, this camera is almost a decade old now. Newer DSLRs and mirrorless cameras are going to be able to push ISOs of 25, 50, even 100,000 and still get usable results. In situations such as sports or wildlife, where you need to use faster shutter speeds and higher ISOs, you're still going to get much better results using a larger sensor. Another advantage of having a larger sensor is being able to have a shallower depth of field and that beautiful bokeh that us photographers are so obsessed with. Blurring the background helps to create a stronger image by emphasizing your subject and reducing distractions. Most phones do offer some kind of software solution to this, like portrait mode on the iPhone, but in my opinion, they're just not quite there yet. When using portrait mode on a very simple subject like this lens, it tends to do really well. The image on the left is taken using portrait mode on the iPhone, and the image on the right is taken with an 85mm f1.4 lens on a Sony a7 III. The iPhone does really well making the edges smooth and adding a natural blur to the ground in front. The phone also did surprisingly well with this shot of my camera, but the reflections in the water don't look nearly as good as they do in the Sony, and too much of the camera strap and the front of the lens are sharp when they should be out of focus. When the subject is a bit more complex, like this fence, the phone doesn't do so well, blurring out parts of the fence that should still be in focus. Same goes for this shot, where the blur on the handrail in the foreground looks a bit blocky and unnatural on the phone. In situations where your subject is more than 2.5 meters away, portrait mode is straight up just gonna refuse to work. And I know I only tested the iPhone, and sure, other phones might do a little better, but I still don't think any phone is going to be able to replace a real fast lens just yet. Most higher end phones these days come with 3 main cameras, usually a main wide angle in the 20 to 30mm range for everyday shooting, a telephoto to get closer to the action, and an ultra wide for getting more of your surroundings into the frame. While these usually cover about 95% of people's needs, for that last 5%, interchangeable lens cameras are still the way to go. Whether you need a longer telephoto for sports, or a tilt shift for architecture, or a macro lens to get up close with nature, being able to switch out your lens for different situations is something that can't be overlooked. Using a traditional camera also gives you a much wider range of focal lengths without sacrificing on quality. On your phone, zooming in between each lens' native focal length is done digitally, meaning you're essentially just cropping in the image and losing some quality. Additionally, the secondary cameras on most smartphones usually use lower end sensors compared with the main camera. On the other hand, a traditional camera with a zoom lens lets you use the entire sensor across a range of focal lengths, offering much more consistent results. This is just personal preference, but I think a lot of people would agree with me when I say the main camera on a lot of phones, including my iPhone, is just too wide. In most situations, 24mm is just a bit too wide to isolate your subject and create a focused composition. I actually find myself using the 77mm telephoto lens a majority of the time, even if it means I have to take a few steps back. To be honest, I'm not sure why the main camera is so wide when we already have an ultra wide, but with a phone you just get what you get. Phone cameras have gotten so good in the last few years, and you can definitely get amazing results out of them. But I still think they have a long way to go before they can replace traditional DSLR and mirrorless cameras. But what about AI? Now, I plan to do a separate video looking more closely at how AI can and will help continue to close the gap between traditional and smartphone cameras. But I think the main issue comes down to one thing: consistency. When we start bringing in AI and computational photography, the software is sort of guessing what a scene should look like, and that can be highly dependent on the situation. For most people, that's okay, but for professionals, a good camera with better raw sensor performance is going to give you more consistently high quality, true to life results. While it's honestly hard to say whether traditional cameras will ever be truly obsolete, I personally don't think so. I mean, features and image quality aside, a lot of people just prefer to use a real camera. I mean, there are still people who prefer to shoot film. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments and tell me what I should do next. If you enjoyed, leave a like and consider subscribing to see more. Thanks.